The Galactic Council had existed for 9,000 years before humanity joined. In all that time, they had accumulated knowledge from over 400 member species. They had collected scientific discoveries, cultural histories, trade agreements, diplomatic records, and countless other pieces of information. The problem was simple but devastating. Nobody could find anything. Nuss stood in the central archive of Station, surrounded by holographic displays that flickered with random data streams. She belonged to the species, beings of crystalline form who had mastered faster-than-light travel 3 before Earth's first civilizations rose. Yet here she stood, completely defeated by the chaos around her. The archive contained approximately 400 trillion documents. They existed in 7,000 different formats, written in 3,000 languages, organized by systems that contradicted each other at every level. The filed things by the emotional resonance of the content. The species sorted by size of the physical medium. They arranged everything according to the phase of their home world's 17 moons at the time of creation. No unified system existed. No master index had ever been created. The archive was effectively useless. Na had spent 40 years searching for a single trade agreement from the year of crystalline harmony. She never found it. The document might not have even existed. There was no way to know. When humans joined the Galactic Council, most species paid them little attention. Humanity was young, barely capable of reaching their nearest stellar neighbors. They had no advanced weapons, no remarkable technologies, no unique biological advantages. They seemed utterly ordinary in every measurable way. The Council assigned human representatives to minor positions. One group of humans ended up working in the Central Archive as a form of diplomatic courtesy. Nobody expected them to accomplish anything significant. The archive had defeated the greatest minds of the galaxy for thousands of years. What could a few humans possibly do? Was 53 years old when she first walked into the Central Archive. She had worked as a librarian at the New Chicago Public Library for 28 years before the space program recruited her. She had spent her entire career organizing information, creating systems, helping people find what they needed. She had never considered herself special in any way. She stood in the archive's main chamber and looked at the chaos surrounding her. Holographic displays showed file names that stretched for hundreds of characters. Data crystals sat in piles that reached toward the ceiling. Documents floated through the air on gravity platforms, moving according to algorithms that had been corrupted centuries ago. Pulled out a small notebook and began to write. Her colleagues, James Wright, and joined her. James had managed the digital archives for the institution for 15 years, had designed database systems for the European Union's Historical Preservation Project. Together, they represented humanity's accumulated knowledge of information management. They started with a simple question: what did the archive contain? Nobody knew the answer. The Council had never conducted a complete inventory. The task seemed impossible. There were too many documents, too many formats, too many languages. Automated systems had tried and failed. The complexity overwhelmed every algorithm. Suggested a different approach. They would not try to catalog everything at once. They would create categories. They would build a structure. They would impose order one section at a time. The observers found this approach amusing. They had tried categorization before. The problem was that different species understood categories differently. The concept of historical versus scientific documentation meant nothing to species that experienced time nonlinearly. The distinction between legal and cultural texts collapsed for species whose laws emerged from religious traditions. Nodded and wrote more notes in her notebook. She spent 3 weeks talking to representatives from every council species. She asked them how they thought about information. She learned their mental frameworks. She discovered their assumptions. Then she did something that nobody had ever attempted before. She created a translation layer. The system did not impose human categories on alien thought. Instead, it created bridges between different conceptual frameworks. A searching by emotional resonance would connect to a human categorical structure which would link to a physical organization system. The same document could exist in multiple conceptual spaces simultaneously, accessible through any framework. James built the technical infrastructure. He designed databases that could handle the complex relationships between different organizational systems. He created search algorithms that could navigate multiple conceptual frameworks at once. He established protocols for adding new species and new ways of thinking. Developed the interface systems. She made tools that any species could use, regardless of their sensory capabilities or cognitive architecture. She built training programs that helped archivists from different worlds understand how to work together. The project took 7 years to complete. 7 years of constant work, endless meetings, countless failures and revisions. 7 years of convincing skeptical alien officials that the project could succeed. 7 years of building something that had never existed before. When they finished, the Central Archive became functional for the first time in its history. Na ran a search for the trade agreement she had sought for 40 years. The system found it in 3 seconds. The document had been misfiled in a section dedicated to agricultural poetry because a long-dead archivist had confused 2 similarly named star systems. The news spread across the galaxy within days. Species began requesting copies of the human organizational system. They wanted to implement similar structures in their own archives. They wanted to hire human archivists to help them organize their records. They wanted to learn how humans thought about information. The Council created a new division called the Office of Universal Documentation, became its first director. Under her leadership, the office trained thousands of archivists from hundreds of species. They standardized documentation practices across the galaxy. They created systems that could handle any type of information, any organizational framework, any way of understanding knowledge. Retired after 20 years of service. By then, the impact of her work had transformed galactic civilization in ways nobody had predicted. Scientists discovered connections between research programs that had been working on similar problems for centuries without knowing about each other. Medical researchers found treatments that had been developed by other species and forgotten. Engineers located technical solutions that solved problems their colleagues had struggled with for generations. The economic impact alone was staggering. Trade became more efficient when species could actually find records of previous agreements. Disputes decreased when historical documentation was accessible. Innovation accelerated when knowledge could flow freely. But the cultural impact was even more significant. Species began to understand each other better. When they could read each other's histories, they found common ground they never knew existed. Ancient conflicts that had seemed inevitable turned out to be based on misunderstandings that better documentation would have prevented. Relationships that had been hostile were transformed into partnerships. The Empire had fought 17 wars with the Confederacy over territorial disputes. When archivists finally organized the relevant records, they discovered that both species had valid claims based on different mapping conventions. A compromise that satisfied everyone took only 6 months to negotiate. They discovered that their supposedly unique philosophy of crystalline consciousness had close parallels in the thought traditions of 3 other species. This discovery led to collaborative research programs that advanced the understanding of consciousness more in 50 years than had occurred in the previous 5,000. Humanity's reputation in the galaxy changed completely. They were no longer seen as the young, primitive species with nothing to offer. They became known as the organizers, the systematizers, the beings who could make sense of chaos. Other species tried to understand how humans had developed this capability. They studied human history and found a story of constant struggle with information overload. Humans had invented writing to manage agricultural surplus. They had created libraries to preserve knowledge across generations. They had developed filing systems, catalog cards, database software, and search engines. Every generation had faced the challenge of organizing more information than the previous generation had imagined possible. Every generation had found ways to cope. They had perfect memory. They never needed to develop external systems for preserving information. They had limited capacity for abstract thought. They had never faced the challenge of managing complex categorical structures. They experienced time in a way that made sequential organization irrelevant. They had never developed chronological filing systems. Humanity had faced every possible challenge related to information management. They had struggled with every type of document, every organizational framework, every search problem. They had failed countless times and learned from every failure. Their expertise was the product of limitation. Because humans had imperfect memories, they had to build systems to remember for them. Because humans had limited cognitive capacity, they had to create structures that reduced complexity. Because humans experienced time linearly, they had to develop ways of navigating nonlinear information spaces. The weaknesses that made humanity seem primitive were actually the source of their greatest strength. Died at the age of 117, surrounded by students and colleagues from 40 different species. Her funeral was broadcast across the galaxy. Trillions of beings watched as her body was placed in a memorial archive that contained the complete record of her life's work. Her final words became famous. She had spoken them to a young archivist who asked what humans understood about information that other species did not. Had smiled and given a simple answer. She said that humans understood that knowledge was useless if you could not find it. She said that the most important thing was not what you knew, but whether you could access what you knew when you needed it. She said that organization was not about imposing order on chaos, but about creating paths through complexity that any mind could follow. The young archivist had written down her words and shared them with colleagues. They spread across the galaxy, translated into every language, adapted to every conceptual framework. They became the founding principles of a new discipline that would shape galactic civilization for. The Central Archive of Station eventually grew to contain over 900 trillion documents. It remained functional and accessible throughout its expansion. New species joined the Council and added their knowledge to the collection. New formats and new organizational frameworks emerged and were integrated into the system. Through it all, the basic structure that and her colleagues had built remained in place. The translation layer they had created continued to bridge different ways of thinking. The categorical system they had designed continued to provide pathways through the vast ocean of information. Monuments to human archivists were erected on 1,000 worlds. Universities established departments dedicated to human information science. Species that had once dismissed humanity as primitive now sent their minds to study at human institutions. And in the corner of every galactic archive, there was a small display that showed the notebook had carried on her first day in the Central Archive. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, diagrams, and questions. They represented the moment when human curiosity and human methodology first encountered a problem that had defeated the galaxy's greatest minds. The notebook was kept in a climate-controlled case, preserved for future generations. The display beneath it contained a simple inscription in 4,000 languages. The inscription read, "She asked what we had, then she helped us find it." That was humanity's gift to the galaxy. Not weapons or technology or biological superiority. Just the simple, profound ability to look at overwhelming chaos and see the possibility of order. Just the patience to build systems that worked for everyone. Just the wisdom to understand that knowledge shared was knowledge. The documentation systems built after human archivists organized those ancient records would continue to serve galactic civilization long after the last human had passed into history. But the memory of those first archivists and the remarkable thing they had accomplished would never be forgotten. Their story would remain accessible, properly filed, easily found whenever anyone wished to learn about the small species that had taught the galaxy how to remember.